Welcome to Illuminated by Morehouse, a conversation series through which the college brings the discourse from its hallowed halls to the digital world to spark intellectual conversations, challenge perspectives, and make an impact. Today's discussion will dive into the truth, impact, recent criticism, and importance of critical race theory, as well as how we move society past the initial triggers of the topic and into a place of understanding and possibly acceptance. I am Nicole Carr, and I'll be your host today. I am an investigative journalist currently reporting for ProPublica on criminal justice, racial inequity, and COVID. I also am proud to be an adjunct journalism professor here at Morehouse College, where I teach social justice journalism. And I'm honored to be joined by two esteemed veteran academics and educators who I will let introduce themselves.
I'm Glaude. I'm the chair of the Department of African American Studies and the James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor here at Princeton University, and a graduate of the mighty class of 1989 of Morehouse College.
I'm Nina Gilbert. I'm the director for the Morehouse Center for Excellence in Education.
We want to begin this conversation with the basics, and that would be defining critical race theory. And for our audience, we'll start with the Britannica definition of CRT, which is the intellectual and social movement and loosely organized framework of legal analysis based on the premise that race is not a natural, biologically grounded feature of physically distinct subgroups of human beings, but a socially constructed or culturally invented category that's used to oppress and exploit people of color. It also exerts, those theorists are often dedicated to applying their understanding of the institutional or structural nature of racism to the concrete, if distant, goal of eliminating all race-based and other unjust hierarchies. And so we'll start with you, Dr. Gilbert, who we talked about kind of struggling with this, going back and forth with what CRT means to you. How do you define this?
Well, I define critical race theory as a concept or framework in legal studies that basically says that racism is permanent. It is pervasive, and it is baked into the laws, the institutions, and systems in American society. And I also believe that it's a framework that can be used, though, to kind of analyze and examine our stories, the stories that are told by people of color, that helps them make sense of situations and incidents where they've experienced racism or discrimination.
Okay. And Dr. Glaude, add to that?
Well, I agree completely. First of all, it's just wonderful to be in conversation with the both of you. I'm delighted, and I look forward to learning so much. So it's, on the one hand, we have to just simply say that critical race theory emerges out of law schools. It's an academic approach to the study of race and law in some ways, right? And, you think about it as in some ways a response to the Bakke decision, trying to get us to understand that any kind of legal remedy to racial discrimination will have to think not just simply about the law, but to move beyond it, to begin to think about the social, historical, and political context and ethical and moral context of the production of race. So there's that. And of course, critical race studies is also linked to critical legal studies, right? Critical legal theory, trying to get us to, again, understand the law in a broader context. And then there's the way in which critical race theory kind of emerges within this broader academic discourse of cultural studies, where we want to see race as a social construction, not as something that's natural, but something that is produced over time with changing, differentiating meanings, right? So understanding that thick history, that thick sociology allows us to intervene in a very different way. And now critical race theory has a much broader application, but we need to understand its academic beginnings. It didn't find its beginnings in kindergarten. It had its beginning in law school and in graduate schools. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, we're going to get into the school systems here in just a moment in this raging debate we see now in the K-12 environment. But before we move on, coming out of the definition, can we talk about how CRT has impacted any of us, either personally, professionally? Where would you see this applying to a situation in your own life?
So that's an interesting question, because I know as a Black woman, right? Like racist interactions or discriminatory experiences, like it's kind of baked in the cake, right? Like we just kind of carry that with us. And I think when those things happen, I don't think like, let me see how I can apply this situation to the critical race theory framework. But I think CRT is sort of a filter that I run things through when I'm feeling uncomfortable, or if I'm in a professional setting and I am feeling a bit bothered by what I'm hearing or experiencing. For example, I was working with a client recently of a very large organization, and they were explaining how committed the company is to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anti-racism. However, the more we talked, it was clear that the conversation was more about, let's make sure though that you are not offended whenever something happens to you. Like you are not supposed to be upset or offended if there's an interaction that makes you feel uncomfortable, because you need to understand we're committed to anti-racism. So let me help you not be offended by that. So of course, that's when I start to think about, like, here is just another example of, maybe unintentional bias and subconscious, unconscious bias and racism, and then thinking, how do I address this? So, critical race theory is very helpful as a framework when you're experiencing these things in the workplace.
So I'll jump in there in the context of a newsroom, and we'll get into information and misinformation or in the media's role in all of this. But you talked about narratives in your definition, and in newsrooms, you have to think about who gets to define objectivity, balance, bias. Whose lens are we looking through?
Right.
And so when we examine the lens of objectivity, and we're shaping narratives, and our newsrooms across the country are responsible for a first draft of history in many cases, and for shaping narratives. And I know the times that have been challenged on whether something is being fair to someone else. I have to ask the question, well, who defines fairness? If we're talking truth, then why are we challenging the truth? Why don't we just lay the truth out there and it falls where it falls? Right. And so when you get folks who are in position to shape narratives and decide what that lens, which lens we're looking through, you get into, I think, the construct of CRT in that setting. Mm-hmm. And newsrooms being the providers of information, and in real time, we're critical to that framework of information here. So if that makes any sense, I can just think of several instances in a newsroom setting where, we could challenge what we're doing through the lens of CRT. And Dr. Glaude, how?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about it directly in terms of the impact on my graduate training. So, Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory, in his classic book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, right, forces one to think about the U.S. context, think about racism, right, in light of this kind of historical sweep, the grappling with deep-seated pessimism by the time he writes that particular book about whether or not the country will change, right, offered me resources, even though he was thinking about it within the context of the law, but provided, I thought then, and I think now, a kind of broader framework to understand how race continues to overdetermine the life chances of folk in this country. And then I think a later generation, although we don't tend to think about this in explicitly, but Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality has really shaped how I understand layered experiences of oppression, that I don't just simply come to the world or exist in the world just simply as a man or a black cis man, and all of from the South, all of these things matter, right? Particularly when we begin to think about gender violence and the like. So at the level of theory, these two moments were really important to help me see, right, practice, to understand what we're doing in real time. I encountered both in graduate school and in the early stages of my academic career, and they both shaped how I think about matters. So that's how I would answer that question.
Awesome. So let's get into coming out of the definition and the impact with each of us. Let's talk about what CRT is not, and how these these false definitions or misinformation or whatever has started to fly around about what it is or what it isn't. What do you think is maybe the biggest misconception around CRT?
Well, I tell you, it's not a curriculum. It's not a pedagogical approach, right? There's not a teacher at home working on lesson plans and putting her lesson plans or his lesson plans, critical race theory, second period. Like, that's not happening, right? So it's not that. I do think there's this manufactured hysteria around how history is being interpreted. And so, the push to remove kind of racially sensitive topics from the curriculum for fear that we are on the slippery slope around critical race theory is, once again, something that is a red herring and just, I think, a way to deflect from larger issues. So I think the opponents to critical race theory really have something else in mind. I think there is an intentional conflating and confusing of issues. It's not an indictment against a race of people, right? Like, history is what it is,
sure,
right? And so we can talk about the atrocities, some of the sins of this country without talking about the race of the people who inflicted the pain upon other people. But history is what it is.
Right. It's a fact. It's a fact.
Yes.
Sure.
We can be even more direct, Doc, and go to Christopher Rufo's Twitter feed.
Yes.
I have it.
Yes.
And there's nothing like receipts. He says, we have successfully frozen their brand, quote unquote, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it, critical race theory, toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Right.
So there is the political strategy explicitly stated by the fellow who is at the heart of propagating this nonsense.
So this is a natural transition, I think, into media's role. Okay. And when you're doing a story on this and you treat a definition as what one person is telling you it is rather than what it actually is, then you play into this cycle of hysteria, right? So we say, oh, the school board chair says, this is an urgent matter. We must get this out of the curriculum. And in the early stages of reporting, I think you see it more now, where there will be a graph that points out what CRT is not and that it's not being taught in the schools. But let's go back a few months. Let's go back to the summer months when the school board started taking this up and voting to keep it out of the upcoming curriculum. I can't remember too many reports in mainstream mass media, especially local media, that would point out this is not a thing. It's just not a thing. And so when the messaging to the public from your local news or whoever says, okay, it's they're taking this up and they're going to vote on this, but you fail to say what it isn't, that you're addressing something that's not a thing.
And how do you prove something that's not? Right? How do you prove that something is not a thing? Because some of the same people who oppose this and who are adamant that it is a thing also don't know what's in the curriculum. So they don't know that there are standards. There are standards in the or state standards and national standards that outline what teachers are supposed to teach, what students must know by the end of any specific grade, by the end of a year, by the end of their high school, by the time they finish high school. Like, so we're supposed to teach content. And in that content, Civil War, Revolutionary War, you have the Trail of Tears. How do you sanitize all of history? How do you not teach that, over 4,000 Native people lost their lives during the Trail of Tears? You can't, how do you not teach about the Holocaust? But if you talk about these things, school boards and state boards of education are now saying that teachers are going to be held accountable for how they interpret history, not just for teaching it, how you interpret. So these people don't even understand curriculum, first of all. So to say that we need to remove CRT from the curriculum is like saying to me, we need to remove procedures for how to conduct open heart surgery from the science curriculum. No science teacher is teaching that. That's something that you may learn in medical school, right? So it's a non-issue.
That messaging hasn't been elevated enough, though, that it's a non-issue. Do you agree? I mean, when explaining these things, going back to the media's role, what do you make of that, Dr. Glaude?
Well, I think it's really important for us to pan out for a second, right? Critical race theory as the kind of source of the latest panic emerges in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection. Right. So, and that January 6th insurrection was all about, you will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. You will not replace us. It's about we will stop the steal. And when they talk about stopping the steal, who are they talking about? They're talking about Atlanta. They're talking about Philadelphia. They're talking about Milwaukee, Detroit, us, right? Black voters. So this is a response to demographic shifts that have impacted the electoral process. At the very moment, 2 days after, or the day after the insurrection, Georgia elected its first Jewish and African-American senator. All hell broke loose. So now it shifts to the kind of educational front. Not only are they trying to replace us politically, they're trying to displace us historiographically. And this is, of course, tied to 1619 Project and tied to questions around Civil War memorials. So as Nicole Hannah-Jones in the New York Times has us trying to rethink our origins, our beginnings, by narrating the story of American democracy to include the issue of slavery, the violence that has defined the beginnings of the country, by shifting to Jamestown, right? And all of the stuff that was generated to respond to it. Remember, 1619 Project, the 1776 Project, whatever the hell that is,
that commission
was a response to it. And then Black Lives Matter, of course, is happening, and you have the all-out assault on civil rights, Civil War memorials, taking down the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond, Stonewall Jackson, and the like. And so there is this sense in which this historical front is another front that was opened in relation to what we saw on January 6th and what we tend to associate with Donald Trump. All of this then gets captured by the language of critical race theory. So 1619 Project, Civil War history, right? All of that, the shorthand becomes that's critical race theory. And that involves kind of teaching our children that we are violent, teaching our children that they themselves ought to feel guilty, right? And then lo and behold, we get this moral panic that then metastasizes in this way. Now, remember, this is the same thing that happened with the Tea Party and Obamacare. People don't see this as related in interesting sorts of ways. But remember when Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, the Health Care Act was being debated, we saw all of these AstroTurf protests. These people worried about death panels, these folk worried about infringing on their freedoms. And social scientists were screaming from the top of their lungs that what was underneath this was a deep kind of nativism, a kind of ugly racism and xenophobia. CRT is just an extension of that same impulse, just directed at our schools.
Well,
At least that's my view. And the press played a role in amplifying it all.
And that's going back to that. I can remember, and not with my current outlet, but previous outlet, being asked to kind of explain this and to break it down. And I passed on the assignment for a number of reasons. One, we're in the digital age, and I was waiting for someone to dig up something and say, "Oh, well, you're friends with Nicole Hannah-Jones," or you know, because this got somehow jumbled and framed around 1619, as you just explained, which is that would not have been a thing, but people are looking for ways to amplify the idea of fake news or a conspiracy theory about the way that liberal news media pushes out information, right? So I don't even want to deal with that. But furthermore, the way I would have framed that here in Georgia, we were just coming out of last summer as our Governor Brian Kemp, repealed the citizens arrest law, right? In the wake of Ahmaud Arbery's murder. When he did that, he gave a speech at the state capitol about why he was doing this. And he talked about it being rooted in an archaic law that has no place in Georgia. Well, what was that law? It was the very framework that allowed overseers or white men in general to capture a Negro, kill him, take him back to his master, do whatever you need to do. But I have authority over you. And here is the law that puts it in writing, whether I own a plantation, whether I have whatever I am, it doesn't matter. I'm a white man and you are not.
Mm-hmm.
And I have total authority over you. So as he explained repealing this and saying it had no place in Georgia, I said, this is the very essence of critical race theory, right? We're working in a framework that allowed these men who are now on trial starting today to explain, I had the right to do this, and Georgia said I had the right. And here's my defense. Here's my defense in this. There is a law that allows me to do this. That's a framework. That's a system. That plays into legality. Mm-hmm. I don't think any journalist to this day has asked the governor how he is opposed to critical race theory when he used it to explain repealing a law that was on the books here in Georgia.
Well, I have another question for the governor. In May, I do believe it was May, he signed into law a bill called the Teacher Pipeline legislation, mm-hmm. and it supports strengthening teacher preparation programs at HBCUs. Mm-hmm. 30 days later, mm-hmm. he endorsed a resolution that states, it didn't name critical race theory, but it did say that he is applauding the state board for a resolution that states that Georgia is not a racist state. The country is not a racist country. And teachers are not to teach any material that would cause students to feel guilt, anguish, or shame. And that slavery was an aberration and was not aligned with the intent of the founding fathers in the founding of the country. And it goes on to say that schools, teachers will be held accountable or penalized if they are teaching content in a way that does not align with this resolution. Okay, so I felt like higher ed was pretty quiet about this.
Sure.
And I was outraged because there's also a clause that states that teacher preparation programs that receive federal funding will have those funds withheld if they prepare educators to teach material in a way that can cause guilt, anguish, and shame. So how am I to recruit Black male educators? We've identified that less than 2% of the teaching force is comprised of Black males, mm-hmm. right? We're mm-hmm. asking Black males to enter the education sector, but don't bring your whole selves, right? Don't come here talking about your ancestors. Don't come talking about, history in a way that is authentic and honest and truthful.
Right.
So the hypocrisy and the contradictions astound me. We are a private school. We receive federal funds for some of our programs. But how do we reconcile this, right? And so if higher ed feels that this is not our issue, this is a K-12 matter, well, newsflash, right? Like our students come from K-12,
Sure.
right? And so, and as we prepare educators for the K-12 sector, how do we prepare students to go into classrooms, go into schools throughout this country, knowing that they will possibly be reprimanded if they teach in a way that they were trained to, and in a way that aligns with their own lived experiences?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have to understand the situation for what it is. These are not good faith actors. So to describe the contradictions, to single out the hypocrisy, right, isn't the point for them. Whether they got critical race theory right isn't the point. And we find ourselves arguing about the category when in fact that's exactly what they want us to do. Because the idea to appeal to critical race theory is to appeal to this idea, to appeal to this sense that America is no longer what it was, right? And to insist that the country is not racist, and to prohibit teaching the country's history in such a way that may contradict that claim, is in some ways designed to arrest attempts to fundamentally transform the country. Remember, at the very moment in which Black Lives Matter is pushing, and we're about to get genuine police reform, we're about to get genuine efforts to address the idea that the country is a white nation in the vein of old Europe. What do we hear Tim Scott say in response to President Biden? Tim Scott, this Black Southern senator from South Carolina, was charged by the Republican Party to respond to the State of the Union. And what does he say? America is not a racist country. We can debate that, but the point of saying it is to arrest attempts to remedy racial inequality in the country. We're not racist. They're just simply these kind of aberrant practices that are not central to who we are. But it wasn't just simply Tim Scott who said it. Vice President Kamala Harris said it. We're not a racist country. We just have to deal with our history. That formulation took the argument and put it on that terrain. And then Christopher Rufo said, everything we don't like about this effort to address racial inequality and injustice, we will call it critical race theory. And here we are trying to argue with them as if they're good faith actors when they're just playing politics with people's fears.
Yeah. So if we think about, we go to Ecclesiastes and we talk about there's nothing new under the sun, right? So things are cyclical. We've been in this space before where we've tried to rewrite history. I don't know that we've tried to rewrite it as quickly as we just did after January 6th. This was rewriting in real time, and it continues to be, it continues to be that. I don't know how many weeks was it or days before that was turned into the field trip. No matter what your eyes saw, no matter what your ears heard, this was a group of people saying, you did not see what you saw happen. This was not, and it continues to be this. My mind is going back to Clint Smith's How the Word Was Passed and examining the damage that is done, the toll that a lie takes on society, right? It shapes the way we move in every sector of our lives, the way we think, the way we socialize, all of these things. And to read in the first chapter in Monticello, to read the thoughts of people who say, I live 15 minutes away from here, a half hour from here. I was never taught XYZ about this place. And now in my 60s, I have a different idea about what I was living next to. Mm-hmm. A lot will shape our total being, and you may not come out of it. So what is the danger of not addressing this head on right now? The truth. What is the danger in not addressing the truth and pushing the truth aggressively? What does that mean?
The truth is so ugly, right? And it's ugly for the people who had ill intent. They wanted to cause harm. And it reminds me of Derek Bell's interest convergence theory, where Black people's quest for equality and equity will only happen when it converges with the interest of white people, right? So Brown versus Board of Education is an example. We all thought that was the moment of reckoning. We now our schools are integrated. That's wonderful. But was it? So my parents were the first Black teachers, or among the first Black teachers, to integrate the all-white high school in my hometown. And it wasn't until I was in higher education and looking at all of the research and the data and the scholarship about this shrinking population of Black teachers and how few Black male teachers there are. And I thought, my father was a Black male teacher. Mm-hmm. His fraternity brothers were teachers. The Black men who attended my church were teachers. The Black men who lived in my community were teachers. I knew a lot of Black male teachers growing up. What happened to them? So I asked my mom, I said, Mom, what happened to the Black teachers when you and Dad left this high school and went to the integrated high school? She didn't know. Mm-hmm. She had to think. And that's how many years later? This was in the late 60s, early 70s. She was, I don't know. Mm-hmm. You never thought about that? You never thought what happened to these teachers who you worked with for years? Why didn't they end up at the high school? So we displaced so many Black teachers during integration. And so did it really work for us? It was to make sure that we looked better in the eyes of our international community, right? It really wasn't about making sure that Black children had an equitable experience, because we would have kept their Black teachers. Black teachers would have benefited white students as well, but they didn't want the Black teachers in the white schools. So I think that it's important for us to be critical thinkers and understand that some of the performative activism and advocacy that we see, is it really in our best interest? What's the bottom line? What is it that we don't know?
So my mind is kind of going toward protecting our institutions, much like the one we're sitting in today. So when we think about the beginnings and historically Black colleges and universities and where we stand today, how critical is the protection of our institutions in this quest for truth and going out in the world and teaching it and accepting it and living it?
I think it's these institutions like Morehouse are absolutely critical in this moment. We've witnessed some hard times. We've seen over the last few decades a number of HBCUs close their doors. We've seen Black institutional life, right, collapse right in front of us. Black-owned theater companies, we can go down the line, right? Since the Great Recession of 2008, many of those institutions that they work like barrier islands in relation to the storms, the headwinds coming at us. Mm-hmm. Many of those institutions are barely standing The foundations have been shaken or cracked at the core. So look, the country is in the midst of a betrayal again, of turning its back on its promise again. The question is, what are we going to do in response to it? What we do know is we've seen an uptick in applications across the landscape of historically Black college and universities around the country. Their applications are soaring. Why? Because Black and brown students want to find spaces where they're not only affirmed and educated, but places where they can become who they imagine themselves to be without the burden of the white gaze defining and limiting how they understand themselves, right? So that's happening, but the environment is a hostile one. There are those among us who cleave to the idea that America must remain a white nation in the vein of old Europe. And they are trying to do that at the level of politics. They're trying to make that a certainty at the level of politics and at the level of education. So K through 12 is a battlefront, not just simply HBCUs where they get to college, freshmen, sophomore, but K through 12 is a battlefront. If we don't understand that we have to fight this battle over the kinds of stories we tell ourselves about who we are, with Black, white, brown, we have to narrate a different story of who we are as Americans. If we don't, then these folk are going to insist that you and I believe that we are simply latecomers, that we are the objects of charity or philanthropic, generosity, that they've let us be here, that we are not really of this place in some ways. So the stakes are high because, how can I put this? I've said this across the country. Every time a new America is about to be born, every single time, the umbilical cord of white supremacy has been wrapped around the baby's neck, choking the life out of it.
Wow.
So we got to become better midwives. And the midwives are being trained at places like Morehouse.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You see?
So, that's so powerful. So we have to move beyond this distraction of what critical race theory is or is not,
Sure.
right? And so part of our conceptual and theoretical framework that kind of undergirds everything that we do in our educator prep program has at its core social justice and racial literacy,
Sure.
right?
Mhm.
And appreciative inquiry, right? So one of the texts that we use is Dr. King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, right? So it is time to move forward and go beyond our stories and be a lot more reflective. What do our stories tell us? And focus on racial literacy in a way that we are able to kind of analyze, examine our experiences, examine all of the many nuances of racism and all of its cousins, communicate effectively, strategize, plan, right? And keep moving and continue to create the environments that we need that can be sustainable, right? Like we need to make sure a place like Morehouse is here, for another 154 years or longer, but we also need our K-12 environments to make sure that we are protecting our history and our stories. And then there's work to be done as we prepare educators. And so it's not just that we think about critical race theory in a way that's inappropriate as an academic framework. Folks are also saying, the folks who have these misconceptions, they're saying that empathy and social emotional learning, those are precursors to critical race theory. So now we cannot even talk about empathy in schools because we don't want our students to empathize with the stories that we hear in history. But it's okay for us to tell stories, whether it's Little Red Riding Hood, or the three bears or the three pigs. We empathize with the pigs when they lose their homes. We can tell those stories. The Wizard of Oz and the what's her name from Dorothy,
Dorothy,
trying to find her way home. But can we also tell stories about Emmett Till?
Mm-hmm.
He was a child.
Mm-hmm.
Can we tell stories about Ruby Bridges and develop empathy for that story?
Sure.
Right. So if storytelling works in K-12, it's always worked. We also need to find a way to weave these stories, these real human stories into the curriculum. But of course, those who oppose this will say, you're bringing in critical race theory. Right. So it doesn't matter what we call it.
Right.
If it's critical race theory today, tomorrow it will be something else.
When you talk about the point of empathy too, we're also at a cross section or where we're addressing this in terms of COVID protocols and policies and how we even stay alive today. And so we're seeing a lot of empathy missing from everything that is critical to us in this time. And so that's another thing to address. When I talk to my Morehouse men and I teach them, someone asked me, another Black journalist, a longtime friend, said, so what is social justice journalism? What are you going to teach them? Are you teaching them to be advocates for something? And I paused and I said, I am. I'm teaching them to be advocates for the truth because the truth still exists and a fact can be proven. And so, when we talk about narratives and storytelling, everything that impacts us and the way that systems shape our lives is proven in the data. There is data to prove these things. So I say, think critically about your storytelling and your approach to something. Don't be a press release journalist. Don't take someone's word for what it is, because as we see, we come up with our own narratives and move accordingly, right? Even if it's the big lie. And so facts can be proven. There is data to prove it. And it is your job to tell a story through a lens of truth, not through partisanship, not through feelings, not through anything else around truth. All those things can play a role in how the story is shaped. But to get to the core of a story and the core of it, you have to get the truth, and it is provable.
Mm-hmm.
There is data.
That's right.
And the choices we make too, Nicole, are really important. So I'm thinking about this moment with W.E.B. Du Bois, at Atlanta University, And Du Bois, for much of his early career, thought racism was a matter of ignorance. And he said that the only thing that we needed to do was to gather the data, to present the facts, in order to dispel the ignorance. And once we dispel the ignorance, then we will be on the right road. But then Du Bois saw Sam Hose's knuckles in the window of a storefront in downtown Atlanta. Sam Hose, who had been lynched, and the knuckles were gathered as a souvenir of this ritual of violence. And Du Bois writes in Dusk of Dawn that it's at that moment that he realized that this wasn't a matter of a lack of knowledge or ignorance, that something else was at the core of this. So you're absolutely right. Facts can be proven. The truth must guide how one writes the story. But you are your mama's child too. I'm now from Mississippi. I'm from Moss Point. There are a set of values that animate how you orient yourself to the world. And if you are committed to a conception of the good, that every human being, no matter their gender, no matter their zip code, no matter the color of their skin, no matter who they love, are deserving of dignity and standing. If the operative value for your work is that everyone should be treated justly, then the kinds of stories you write, the people you highlight, what you want to expose. In other words, your values guide you in a particular direction, not to direct the end game of your story, but how you enter your story, what you choose to write about. And so part of what I think we have to do in this moment, right? In this moment, over 700,000 people dead. And these people don't even want to put on a damn mask. That there's been an evisceration of any robust conception of the public good because we have been reduced to self-interested persons in competition and rivalry with each other. We don't see ourselves in relation to each other. And Black and brown people and poor people are disproportionately being impacted by this. We're dying at alarming rates. We have to tell the truth with a conception, with an idea of the public good, motivating our entree into the public domain. And I'll say this, really, I know I'm talking too much. And Dr. Gilbert, you know, we're prone, Morehouse, Nicole, Morehouse men are prone to do this. Y'all know this. But I'll say this really quickly. At the heart of Du Bois's conception of education is the German conception of Bildung. That is the formation of character. We're trying to make education is about producing a particular kind of human being. I made my way through Morehouse as a country boy through Mississippi, and I was educated to orient myself to the world in a particular sort of way, trained at Princeton, but educated at Morehouse.
That's right. That's right.
And so the question becomes, if we allow these people, well, it's not even the question, it's the issue. If we allow these people to do to public education, to what they're trying to do to it, they're going to produce even more selfish, mean-spirited, ugly people that will be the death of this democracy. So we have to understand our lanes and understand how we're being charged to do some ethical and moral work here. That's what that's a long-winded way of trying to get at the stakes of it all. Over 700,000 dead. We just add Colin Powell today.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, so it's just mind-blowing when you think about it. And these people they're, as my mama would say, these people are running around here like they've lost their damn mind.
Yeah.
Because
Perhaps they have.
They have. I do think that we give too much credit to, I don't think it's insanity. I think it's intentional. I think this is discriminatory by design. I think systems are working the way they were designed to. And I want to maintain a sense of optimism while doing what I can do to prepare the next generation of educators, while also looking for an exit plan, like telling my kids and my family, keep your passports, because is this place going to be, is it sustainable to live in a country where we can now tell different stories about what we know to be the truth, right? If we know, and so we talk about data, but if we know 700,000 people have died from a preventable, in some cases, disease, but we refuse to allow people to wear a mask. And in some states, we have a governor saying that it is okay if you have been diagnosed with COVID, you don't have to stay out of school. You can go right back.
Yeah.
In the name of liberty.
Because it's your right. But it's not my right to tell my story, right? I can't tell, I don't even have ownership of my story, but you have the right to possibly infect me and kill me because that's your right. So I just don't know. And because we are in a space now where we have been told that our votes don't count, yes, the person who won the election actually won the election. So now because we are controlling narratives, no matter who wins the next election, there will always be doubt, whether it's Democrat or Republican. How can we trust, because there's been so much misinformation, there are so many counter narratives. Can we ever really understand what truth really is? Who gets to define what's true and what's not?
And that, yes, and that goes back to something that bothers me. I mean, it was among the journalists covering the election, and we were doing very basic stories about process, right? So it was this idea, if we just lay out the facts, this is what happens with an absentee ballot from the moment you request it to the time that your vote is counted. And this is why what you're saying is impossible. It cannot happen because that's just not in the pathway of an absentee ballot. Many journalists have, I don't know when they will tell these stories. They've not told the stories of how many of us had private security. I'm not going to get into anything. I don't want to go there. For me, professionally, that was a part of a turning point. I think during the pandemic, we all realized how we could better use our time, better pay attention to our families, live our best lives for however long we have in this place, because we don't have long. Okay. But for me, it also caused a shift professionally, because I needed to be in a space where you could define the end goal, right? So we want objectivity, we want truth, we want balance. And I came into a newsroom where there's actually a mantra. It's investigative journalism with a moral force. And I've had former colleagues, former bosses say, well, that's left-leaning. They put partisanship to morality. And I think that is a part of the problem. Should that not all be a blanket concept that we live our lives by? Morality? Now, this goes back to the question of who defines it. Who defines it? But what we can all agree on, whether you intentionally play into it or not, is that there is no morality in a lie, in dishonesty, in intentional harm. And we're in an environment where all of that is at play. And I guess the best or the simplest way to define it is, the devil is a devil of confusion. And so we talk about people understanding a definition and understanding the data, but intentionally choosing to be harmful. It sows confusion, because then we have this debate, right? Then we sit here and say, well, this doesn't make sense. If I can say, this is not what you say it is, and this is how you prove it, and this is why we don't want to get into this space, but we get into the space anyway, we just argue in the midst of confusion. And so for believers, for the people who believe in this spiritual realm, you're dancing with the devil. You're dancing with the devil when you dance with dishonesty, with harm.
Yeah. And I just feel like the truth does not need defending. And a lie is a lie, regardless of who tells it, whether it's a teacher, a politician, or a journalist. It's still a lie.
That's right.
Right. And so I think, though, if we can get to a place, I don't know if this is possible, if we get to a place where we will just respect each other's stories. I know I keep talking about stories and storytelling, but if we can respect one's story and know that story is my story, and you don't get to change it
without conditions, not in a performative way, right?
Right. So I was just reading, or I've read the book, and I was listening to a presentation by Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility, and she's talking about this Jackie Robinson story, right? And so the story of Jackie Robinson is, if white people tell it, is he broke the color barrier. Jackie Robinson was a Black man who broke the color barrier in baseball. That's the white version of the story.
Right.
But if Jackie Robinson could tell the story, or if we decided to tell the story about Jackie Robinson in a way where we say, well, Jackie Robinson actually started playing baseball with white people when they let him. Like, they let him play. Like it wasn't that it was not that he was the only talented Black baseball player. And therefore he met the conditions to now, like this is the Negro. Right. This is the magical Negro that we allowed to come into the league. No, there were several others. He was the one that you all let come at that time. But if we tell the story that way, then we have to say why.
Right. Then we have to confront it.
We have to confront why he was the first. And then that applies to every other first. Why is any Black person or Asian person or Latina person, woman, the first to be the first? And why? Because you're the first. That was the first person allowed to enter into that space. And so let's tell that story.
Yeah. And we have Dr. Bernice King always pushing back against people who want to flip the narrative of her father, right? And talk about what he really meant. They do that all the time. Well, King wouldn't have stood for this because he was about this.
And they want to co-opt his philosophy and his teaching and
all of that. What I have these journalism students do is take an article in real time. I want you to see how media covered people in life and in real time versus in death and in hindsight. I say, if the people and the actions have not changed, why do you have these two pieces of work? These two journalistic pieces. And how long does it take to flip the narrative and get closer to the truth versus what we put out in real time, which is also dangerous because we talk about journalism being a first draft of history. So when we talk about how the word is passed and what we can research and find when we're seeking truth, then journalism, in terms of being a piece of democracy and a bedrock, the fourth estate, it is critical that we center this in a way that is married to the truth. I can't say that enough, as simplistic as it is, because it's right there. It's a part of it's a denominator in our democracy. And so if we're not training people to write the first draft as it is, to say what is real, what is true, we're losing generations in this realm as well.
But it also makes me wonder with media, there's so many other stories that need to be told that don't get told. And I'm thinking about the young lady who's been missing, Gabby Patina. Like we've that's been covered a lot, right? But there are countless numbers of Black children missing. There's a young man from the University of Illinois killed. No one's been covering that story. Like, so we don't even value Black lives in the media, although we say we do, right? So we'll cover the protests and the Black Lives Matter, protests and all of the stuff around George Floyd. But do we really care about all of the Black lives, right? But, when we see that there's been some and my heartfelt condolences go out to any family that's lost a child or a family member. But the value that we placed on the white life versus a Black life is not even balanced in reporting. Well, and in media, I believe we've spent more time reporting on how that is an issue than actually changing the practice of how we report. And so there you get back into this cycle. And that's where we become performative in our actions, in our pursuit of balance, or whatever we're headed toward. I guess as we enter final thoughts in this space, we've talked about what needs to be done and how to move forward. Are they realistic expectations, or do we just become another chapter in this country's history that folks look at in hindsight and say, this is what should have been done in this time, or this is where we went
wrong, or this is what we did right. Are our actions or action plans realistic? Do they have to be, right? They have to be.
So I don't know. So like Dr. Glaude, I'm in the class of 89. So I've had enough experience in my life that I've tried to make change. I've tried to make first order change and second order change. Like I'm going to make change within the system.
Sure.
That didn't work. I'm going to make change, maybe slightly outside of the system. That has had some impact, not as much as I'd like. Then I guess, third, fourth order change is just blow it all up, right? Like just the systems don't work. It's not meant to work. So just do something else. So I have gone from I want to change the world to like wake up every day asking God to just order my steps in this day, and he gives me my orders. And so I see, for me, it's about maintaining a posture of optimism and hope that's grounded in reality, using the wisdom of our ancestors and those who've gone before us, while also learning, from some of the young folks today, because I will tell my kids, like, when I was your age, and they're like, you've never been my age. Like you've never been my age. You've never been 20 something in a Trump era with social media and hybrid cars and, cryptocurrency. Like, no, you're right. I've never been there. But so there's something to learn, sure, I think, from, everyone who surrounds us. And I think there has to be some type of intergenerational dialogue while we still have some of our living legends around us. But also I'm still thinking about, where we go from here, chaos or community. We do have a choice.
Sure.
We can be a part of the madness and continue to just sit and wring our hands about, critical race theory is not the devil. We can keep doing that. And I learned that as a charter school leader. I was fighting people who were saying charter schools are not public schools. And I'm like, yes, we are. And I realized it doesn't really matter. Like, just do your work. Right. I've worked in charter schools. I've worked in public schools. Right. I've worked in private schools. Like, just educate the babies wherever they are. So I've just kind of shied away from being embroiled in every fight. Right. And doing the work that I'm called and purposed to do, and just help, prepare the next generation.
Dr.
I was thinking about your question. And one of my favorite formulations comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson. He says, God speaks to us through our imaginations. And whenever I tell my students this, I say, well, if that's true, then what is the devil doing? The imagination is so critical, right? So when we begin to assess whether or not what we're doing now is realistic, we have to place it against what the imaginative work of dreaming of a different way of being in the world is doing for us. Because what people want us to do over and over again is to settle for the choices right in front of us.
Yes.
Is to say, this is all you have. You can't imagine anything beyond these particular constraints. So if that is true, going back to what Dr. Gilbert said about our ancestors, there's nothing about the condition of slavery which would lead the enslaved to believe they could be anything but a slave.
Sure.
But there could be a moment where you see the love in someone's eyes right in front of you, even though that person could be snatched from you at any time. But you see the glimmer of love in his eyes, or you hear the innocence of laughter of a child who's going to see some brutality, witness brutality that no child should ever see. But you hear outside your cabin the laughter of your child who may be sold from you. But that glimmer of love, that sound, however fleeting, of innocence, gives you the basis to imagine life, as Charles Long would say, beyond the opacity of your condition. So what does it mean for us in this moment to refuse to settle for the terms as is, right? And to then force and push, right? The argument. We have to be bolder. We can't take the bribe. Oh, hallelujah. You can't take the bribe.
Hallelujah.
Right. You can't take the bribe. We have to be more courageous. And we have to understand what Jimmy Baldwin says. And he taught me this lesson as I worked with him on my latest book. We have to understand that hope is invented every day. And if you have to invent hope every day, that means you have to beat back despair every day. You just got to figure out how to swing your feet off the side of your bed and plant them on the floor and get up and keep fighting for a better and more just world. So the short answer to your question is no, it's not unrealistic. We got to dream. We got to dream big dreams. We got to do what Coltrane did in Giant Steps. When you hear the solo, that introductory solo to Giant Steps, it was so beyond anything the pianist had ever heard. He didn't know what to do. He just started fumbling with the keys. He had never heard of anything like that in his life before.
Right.
Swing your feet off the bed, plant them on the floor, and take giant steps. That's what we have to do.
That's what we have to do.
I think that is a profound way to wrap our conversation.
Yes.
I cannot thank you two enough for joining me here today, Dr. Glaude, Dr. Gilbert. What a time.
What a time.
What a time. That's all for another episode of Illuminated by Morehouse. And we just want to thank Dr. Gilbert and Dr. Glaude for your time and your work. Be sure to like and follow Morehouse College on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter to stay up to date on daily news and happenings with the college. Please stay safe, stay open-minded and informed, and stay tuned for the next episode of Illuminated by Morehouse. Thank you for watching.